Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of the All Things Marine Life podcast. I'm your host, Caleb, and I'm very happy that you guys have tuned in. So I had done a poll on my Instagram. If you follow me on Instagram at All Things Marine Life, you saw the poll the other day asking if anybody would be interested if I did a podcast. Here we are. I'm giving it a go. If this does well, I have no problem doing more. So today's podcast, I had you all vote on a topic, and today we are talking about cuttlefish, and I am very happy to talk about cuttlefish because cephalopods are my favorite animals. That's right. Cephalopods are a group of animals. It's a group that contains cuttlefish, octopus, squid, and the very odd nautilus. Now, cuttlefish are perhaps one of the lesser studied groups or lesser known groups. Many people that might know about octopus and squid may not even know what a cuttlefish is. Is it a fish? Is it a mollusk? It is indeed a mollusk. It is not a fish, but that name can get a little confusing for people. So, without further ado, I am going to get right into this podcast. We're going to talk about what cuttlefish are. We're going to talk about what makes them so unique. How they are able to camouflage, some of their incredible mating strategies that we'll talk about much later in the podcast, and a whole lot more. I also have lots of questions from you guys. I'll talk about those as well at the end of the podcast, talking about how all the different stuff about cuttlefish. You know what I'm saying. So some of these questions, I'll talk about those at the end. But buckle up. We're going to go ahead and get right into what is a cuttlefish. I've been very excited to talk about cuttlefish. Many of you voted on this poll asking which one should be featured first, and cuttlefish won by a landslide. So thank you for that. Cephalopods, if you know me personally, if you're one of my friends and you're listening, you know that I love cephalopods. Octopus, squid, cuttlefish, they're my favorite animals. They're just living aliens. That's just the way I see it. So I'm not complaining at all. It's a very easy way to start off this podcast series for sure. So a little teaser to start off. If you've ever heard of a bobtail squid, they're actually not squids at all. They're actually more closely related to cuttlefish than to true squids. Maybe I'll do a future podcast or a future YouTube video on them in the future. Now, flamboyant cuttlefish, which we'll talk about a few times throughout the podcast, they're a small species of cuttlefish that walk on the seafloor rather than swim because they have a small cuttlebone. Now, what is a cuttlebone? We'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll also talk about some cross-dressing giant cuttlefish. Yep, you heard that right. There are male cuttlefish that will disguise themselves as females during the mating process. This happens in Australia. I'll talk a lot more about that later in the podcasts. But to start off, let's talk about some basic biology in regards to cuttlefish, or cuttlefish 101, if you will. So cuttlefish, they belong to the order Cepeda under the superorder Decapodiformes. Decapodiformes basically includes any cephalopods that have 10 limbs. So when you think of octopus, they have 8 limbs. Now most people would call them tentacles, but they're actually not tentacles. So cephalopods, when we're talking about cephalopods, we are talking about a couple of different types of appendages. There's arms, and then there's feeding tentacles, or if you just want to shorten that, make it tentacle. Octopus have 8 arms. Now, what's the difference between an arm and a tentacle? If we're talking about squids and cuttlefish have 10 appendages total, but they have 8 arms and 2 feeding tentacles. Now, those 2 feeding tentacles are going to be the longer appendages that are usually tucked underneath their bodies or inside that lash out to grab prey that is in front of them. Squid also have tentacles. Most squid have those 2 feeding tentacles as well. If you look at your arm and you imagine your arm as a feeding tentacle, just imagine your hand and fingers having the suction cups, and everything else, the rest of your arm has no suction cups. Strictly there just to extend outward and grab prey. Now, if your arm was a cephalopod arm, you would have suction cups down the entire appendage. So that's a good way that I like to talk about it to make it easier for people to understand. So arms are different than tentacles. So all cephalopods have arms, but only a few of them have tentacles. So if you think about it this way, I know it gets kind of confusing. Cuttlefish and squid have 2 tentacles, 8 arms, and octopus have 8 arms, no tentacles. I know it's really confusing. I know I probably just blew a bunch of your minds right now, but there you have it. So moving forward, that was a random rabbit hole I just went down, but that's part of podcasting, I guess. So one thing you should know about me, if you haven't really listened to me or you don't really know who I am, my name's Caleb. I tend to go down these rabbit holes. Sometimes when I'm explaining things, I over-explain them. So hopefully you guys tuning in are okay with that. So anyways, as I was saying, cuttlefish, they belong to the order Cepeda under the superorder Decapodiformes that includes 10-armed cephalopods. It's also the same superorder that includes squid, so they're more closely related to squid in a way than they are to octopus. So there's about over 120 different species of cuttlefish worldwide. I'm sure there's some out there that we don't know about. Some of the more well-known cuttlefish species include the giant cuttlefish, or Sepia apema, which is the largest species that grows up to 1 meter long, or around 3 feet for those Americans out there like me, in length, and they weigh around 10.5 kilograms, or about 23 pounds, sometimes growing to even 26 pounds. They're found around the southern tips of Australia. They form these huge mating aggregations down there during the May and June time, during the months of May and June in Australia. That's usually the winter in Australia. That's when they're found down there. There's a huge mating aggregation that happens. We'll talk about that later in the podcast, but for sake of time, I'll move on to the next cuttlefish species, the flamboyant cuttlefish, or Metasepia pfefferi, or I totally butchered that scientific name. That's okay. Metasepia pfefferi. I hope I got that right. That's okay if I didn't. Anyways, you guys can look it up after the podcast if you're interested. They're very, very small animals. Some of my favorite cephalopods as well. They're just so brightly colored. They're small, only around 8 to 10 centimeters long, maybe about 3 inches for those Americans out there who don't know the translation in size right there. Known for their striking color patterns, and they can walk on the seafloor. They're also known to be poisonous, so they have trace amounts of tetrodotoxin, which is the same kind of toxin found within the saliva of blue-ringed octopus. So I do have a video on my YouTube channel about blue-ringed octopuses. If you'd like to check it out, feel free to check it out. I'll put that link in the description down below. If you're listening on YouTube, great. If you're listening on Spotify, go to my YouTube channel. It is at All Things Marine Life. That is my social on pretty much any social media account you can think of: Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. I even have a Snapchat account that I post on sometimes for those who are on there. Now, another cuttlefish species is going to be the dwarf cuttlefish, or Sepia bandensis. Hopefully I got that right. Also a very, very small species. They're very popular in some specialized aquarium settings, but they're very challenging to keep. That goes for most cuttlefish and most cephalopods in general. I've always said I wanted to have a pet octopus, but I don't think I could do it because I would get too attached to it, and they only have a short lifespan, usually of around 1 to 2 years. So would get too attached to it and would be pretty devastated when the octopus died. Although if I had an octopus, I would name it Otto. If I'm being quite honest, I just think that's such a fitting name. Maybe it's because I watched Spider-Man growing up and I liked Dr. Octopus, Otto Octavius, yada yada yada. Anyways, that is a whole other discussion. But I told you I will go down some rabbit holes here and there as we are going throughout the podcast. That's part of what makes podcasting so unique, in my opinion. So there we go. Anyways, there is a difference between the arms and tentacles. I've already talked about that. So cuttlefish, once again, have 2 feeding tentacles and 8 arms, and they use those tentacles to shoot forward and grab prey. So with that being said, think of a chameleon or even a frog. When they use their long tongue to reach out and grab an insect or something, it's kind of the same premise with those tentacles. They shoot forward to grab prey and bring it closer to their mouths. Now, if you don't know what a cephalopod mouth is, imagine a parrot's beak. It looks very similar to that. It is going to be a beak. There is a radula as well that helps them shred up prey items to allow them to swallow them and consume them. Now, what's interesting about cuttlefish is that they do have blue blood. Similar to their relatives, octopus and squid, they have this bluish-greenish blood, and that's all thanks to a copper-based molecule that they have called hemocyanin. Since hemocyanin isn't as efficient at transporting oxygen as hemoglobin is, the iron-based molecule that's in our blood, they evolved not one, but actually 3 hearts. They have 2 that pump blood to their gills and 1 that circulates the blood to the rest of their body. So they have 3 hearts while we only have 1. Now, octopus and squid also have 3 hearts as a result, and they also have that hemocyanin that is not as efficient as our hemoglobin is. Now, what makes cuttlefish so unique and what kind of sets them apart from other cephalopods like octopus and squid, one of the defining characteristics of cuttlefish is going to be that cuttlebone. Now, it's not an actual bone, but it is made out of calcium carbonate. So it's a porous structure. It has some chambers inside it that they use to help regulate their buoyancy. These small little gas-filled chambers inside it, if you take a cuttlebone and cut it in half, you'll see those chambers, and they can actually adjust how much gas is in those chambers in order to float or sink in the water column. It's pretty unique. If you've heard of a chambered nautilus before, nautilus are a group of other cephalopods, very, very unique cephalopods that have an external shell. Now, the shell is pretty fragile and pretty hollow as well. There are lots of chambers in that shell that they use to kind of regulate their buoyancy as well. It works in a similar way with the cuttlebone with cuttlefish. Now, a fun fact for you is that cuttlebones oftentimes wash up on the shore in the areas where cuttlefish are found, which we will talk about in just a few minutes. So cuttlebones are usually collected and they're actually used as calcium supplements for birds or reptiles over the years. So if you've ever had a bird or a reptile, I actually have a pet leopard gecko. His name is Craig. If you guys are interested in seeing Craig, leave a comment down below. I'll maybe post a quick little video introducing you to Craig if you're interested. So I give him calcium supplements every now and then, and calcium supplements most of the time are made from ground up cuttlebones, which is pretty unique. Now, what's also interesting about cuttlefish is that they have chromatophores. Now, chromatophores are something that most cephalopods have. They're pigment cells that allow them to change color and blend in with their surroundings or communicate with other species or individuals of the same species is what I meant to say. You know what I mean. Basically, they use it for communication as well as camouflage, and they can also use it to hypnotize prey items. Now, what's interesting is that newly hatched cuttlefish, and of course, right now, somebody wants to do some yard work outside, so please excuse that if you hear that in the background. That's okay. Anyways, whatever. This is a podcast. First one. Here we go. Anyways, as soon as they hatch out of their eggs, they immediately have the lobes in their brain that allow them to control their chromatophores. They're fully developed. They can start camouflaging the moment that they're in the real world, which is pretty much a head start in life, which is pretty interesting that they're able to do this right as soon as they hatch. Very, very highly developed as soon as they hatch out of the egg. Now, the sad thing is most of these cuttlefish are going to have almost no parental care while they're out of the egg because most cuttlefish die shortly after mating. This is something that most cephalopods in general have to go through. If you've seen the documentary on Netflix, My Octopus Teacher, then you've probably known as soon as they lay eggs and as soon as they get done mating, shortly after that, it is time for them to pass on, unfortunately. So, where do cuttlefish live? Well, if you live in the US, you don't live near any cuttlefish, any wild cuttlefish, that is. You might be able to go to an aquarium and find one, but if you live in the US, you most likely have never seen a cuttlefish in the wild unless you've been somewhere where they do live. They usually are found in tropical and temperate waters around coastal regions where there's lots of shelter and food for them. They're very, very common in places like the Mediterranean Sea, parts of the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. They're also in the Indo-Pacific region. They are not found in the Americas whatsoever. So if you've been snorkeling in the Caribbean like I have before, you've been diving in the Caribbean or even in the Florida Keys, and you've thought that you've seen a cuttlefish, chances are it wasn't a cuttlefish, it was another kind of cephalopod called a Caribbean reef squid, which I will admit can look very cuttlefish-like. They are pretty thick-bodied squids, and their eyes look very similar to cuttlefish. So, for example, cuttlefish have W-shaped pupils. Now, the Caribbean reef squid does have a very similar eye shape. Their eyes do seem to have that W-shaped pupil, but they are indeed squids and not cuttlefish. Another indicator of cuttlefish, if you're interested, a physical indicator, if you will, is going to be those pupils. So if you look at a cuttlefish eye, they have a W-shaped pupil. If you look at a squid eye, they have a rounded pupil. And if you look at an octopus eye, they have a almost rectangular or sometimes oval-shaped pupil. So if that's all you have to go off of, that's an easy kind of indicator. Now, obviously, you have to be careful with that. There are some exceptions to that rule. For example, the Caribbean reef squid, which can look very similar to a cuttlefish. Now, most cuttlefish species, they prefer to be on sandy bottoms, seagrass beds, or coral reefs where they can easily hide from predators and ambush their prey. And they have some very, very incredible camouflage. In fact, it's some of the most effective camouflage in the animal kingdom, especially thanks to those chromatophores. So one of the coolest things about cuttlefish is their camouflage. They have multiple layers of specialized chromatophores, iridophores, and leucophores that allow them to produce both rapid color shifts and those shimmering effects. So for example, the broad club cuttlefish, or Sepia latimanus, uses a mesmerizing passing cloud display to dazzle or even hypnotize crabs before they strike. It literally ripples bands of color along its body so the crab can get transfixed on it while this cuttlefish is sneaking closer and then gets within striking range, shoots those feeding tentacles out, and the rest is history. So that is how they're using those chromatophores. They can use it to hypnotize prey. They can also use it for other things as well. Cuttlefish are very, very intelligent among invertebrates. They have been observed in laboratory settings, watching other cuttlefish solve puzzles and then replicating that behavior. Some research also suggests that cuttlefish can also wait for better food rewards, kind of similar to how octopuses and even certain vertebrates behave, waiting to see if they can get a better food reward for a behavior. They're very, very, very intelligent, and there's lots of research into cuttlefish intelligence, especially regarding certain cognitive tests that they've taken. So they've also passed tests that have been designed for toddlers. They have passed cognitive tests that have been designed for toddlers, which is pretty interesting to think about. So let's talk about the giant cuttlefish for a minute. This is the one that I wanted to talk about. There's lots of really, really unique ways that they use their mating. So for example, the giant cuttlefish is the largest species, so it's very interesting when it comes to them. They live in Australia. They can get up to about 10 kilograms, a little over 20 pounds or so for Americans out there. These cuttlefish can form huge mating aggregations. Usually in those mating aggregations, there's a ratio of females to males that is usually at least 4-to-1, or 4 females to 1 male, or it can be as much as 11 females to 1 male, meaning that there's lots of competition among the males. So large males will usually battle each other while the smaller males have to get pretty creative in order to mate because they only have one chance to do so. And they definitely get creative. Sometimes the smaller males will actually team up and distract the larger males in a group of 4 or 5 while one of them's mating with the female secretively. Sometimes they'll simply sneak up while the larger male is not aware. But the most incredible way that the smaller males will try to mate with the females is by cross-dressing. They'll hide their 4th pair of arms by mimicking the look of a female. Now, male giant cuttlefish have very long, elaborate, wavy 4th pairs of arms, so the small males kind of tuck them in to resemble a female. They're then able to get past that larger male who now thinks he's getting access to another female, and the sneaker male will then mate with the female while the larger male is not suspecting anything. Sometimes in nature, it's not all about the size. The smaller males actually appear to be very intelligent, and I would argue that they're more intelligent than the larger males because of the way that they have to make these rapid decisions during these mating aggregations. But what's also interesting too, and it's interesting to note, is that females also have a say in the matter. So they can actually choose who they mate with, and usually they tend to reject around 70% of all attempts. But the sneakers tend to succeed more often than the other males do. Females can also store spermatophores from those males. They can store as many as they can store spermatophores from 5 to 8 males, and they can actually manipulate the sperm to pick which male's sperm she uses to fertilize her eggs. So who's the real sneaky one here is the real question. These huge mating aggregations can occur off the coasts of southern Australia during the months of May and June, which is technically winter for them over there. There's usually over 200,000 of these giant cuttlefish that migrate to a small spawning ground in northern Spencer Gulf. Now, the giant cuttlefish is the only cuttlefish that forms these huge spawning aggregations. So it's pretty interesting to think about that right there. Now, for flamboyant cuttlefish, mating and courtship can also be a pretty visually dazzling affair with bursts of vivid purple, yellow, and black patterns displayed all across their body. They are also able to kind of make that wave along their bodies or their mantle. Now, some common misconceptions when it comes to cuttlefish. Even though they're all cephalopods, cuttlefish, squid, and octopus, they're all cephalopods. Cuttlefish have that cuttlebone that sets them apart. Now, squid have something called a pin or a gladius, which is kind of the same thing as a cuttlebone in terms of what it does. It helps give them structure. The only thing it doesn't really help with is that buoyancy. Now, octopuses have no internal shell at all. That's why when we're talking about cephalopods, you're going to see the octopuses squeezing into those harder to reach places because there's nothing really limiting them except for their beaks. So cuttlefish and squid are not able to get into some of those same places that octopus can get to. Some people might think that cuttlefish can be aggressive. They can be very bold hunters at times, but they're not a threat to humans unless they're provoked or cornered. And even then, they're not really going to bite or harm a person. There's not any cases of a cuttlefish actually hurting a person. The only way I can even think of a cuttlefish hurting a person would be either a giant cuttlefish that is being harassed and it's a large giant cuttlefish and it grabs onto maybe a scuba diver's mask or something. But I highly doubt it. In fact, I'm right here at my laptop right now. Right now, I will literally look up while we're doing the podcast, cuttlefish human attack. They're known for not attacking humans. Have they ever killed anybody? No. Yeah, so nothing's really coming up. There's an article, cuttlefish attacks on divers. What does this say right here? Let's see. Cuttlefish attacks on divers. Generally a pleasure to see them. 18 years ago, a large cuttlefish caused somebody to retreat and hide behind rocks a couple of times. That was in 2005. It says right here that this guy has forgotten about an incident at Port Noarlunga South until 2005. This guy told him about how he became the victim of 2 cuttlefish attacks. It happened about, so maybe there has been. There was an article in July 2005 issue of Divelog was Sharon Gowen's report of how she was attacked by a large cuttlefish during a boat dive at Split Solitary near Coffs Harbour, New South Wales. Although I don't know the date, it was on a brisk autumn morning. Sharon says that a huge cuttlefish, about a meter long, attacked her. The cuttle was supposed to be quiet, encountered it, and then it basically came up to her looking curious. It hit her with a thud and wrapped its appendages around her head, mask, and regulators, kind of blinded her vision, pulled the regulator out of her mouth. So that is kind of a freak accident that did happen. So I guess they have attacked people in a way, but it's extremely rare. Now, the other thing I can think of when it comes to cuttlefish being dangerous towards humans, the only other thing that I can think of is the fact that flamboyant cuttlefish have that tetrodotoxin in their tissues. They have trace amounts of it. It's a very, very highly potent toxin. Now, if we're talking about tetrodotoxin in general, it is usually a toxin used in the saliva of blue-ringed octopus. It's 1,000 times more potent than cyanide. So blue-ringed octopus, if it bites somebody, it can actually kill them. They have enough venom to kill 26 adult humans, which is pretty interesting to think about. But another thing when we're talking about flamboyant cuttlefish is that not only that, they do have trace amounts of it, but that means that you would have to pretty much consume them. They don't really have that in their saliva. It's found inside the cuttlefish itself. If you don't know already, if something is poisonous, it means something different than if something is venomous. If something is venomous, it has to inject you with that toxin, whether it be through means of a bite or a sting. If it is poisonous, you have to eat that animal in order to get the toxin. So poison is ingested, venom is injected. That's the easy way I like to remember it. Lots of people use that term interchangeably, and it makes me want to correct them all the time because I'm terrible. I like to correct people if they don't know they're wrong. It's a really bad thing. I'm working on it. It's okay, though. So flamboyant cuttlefish, there you have it. They have tetrodotoxin in their tissues. And the only other way I could think of a cuttlefish actually causing someone to die would be if somebody ate a flamboyant cuttlefish. So there we have it. Told you we would go down these rabbit holes for doing a podcast, so here we are. Many people might wonder how long a cuttlefish can live. They only live around 1 to 2 years, except the giant cuttlefish can kind of live a little bit longer than that. So that's really the only other thing that is a little bit different. Now, I'd like to get into some of these questions. So lots of people sent in some questions, and I'd like to talk about majority of these questions, and I'm going to read off their usernames as well, just so we can get going. Now, for future podcasts, I will be doing this. I will be posting polls on my stories to pick not only the podcast topic. For example, today's is cuttlefish, but I will also be posting whatever the topic is. I'll ask for questions, and I will have you guys submit these questions. I'll read them off and then answer them to the best of my ability. Now, first question, Matilda555555 says, are they more closely related to squid or octopus? Now, the answer to that question is going to be they are more closely related to squid. So, generally speaking, they are more closely related to squid, but they are kind of their own thing altogether. They do share a common ancestor with both squid and octopus, but overall, cuttlefish are kind of their own thing altogether. They are cephalopods. They are closely related to squid and to octopus, but they're more closely related to squids because they are in that superorder Decapodiformes. So they have those 10 appendages rather than the 8 like octopods have. So, why are they called cuttlefish? Well, that is a very good question. So they're called cuttlefish because of that cuttle bone, but I did a little bit of deep diving into it. I just have to pull it up on my computer. And so they use that cuttle bone, but cuttle in the cuttle, geez, I cannot talk today. The cuttle part in the word cuttlefish is derived from the old English name for the species, or the word cuddle. The word basically kind of correlates with some kind of cushion, or the Old Norse coddy, meaning cushion. Like basically when the name was given to him, they basically called it coddy fish, basically saying it was a pillowy fish, even though we all know now they're not fish. They don't have a skeleton. They are definitely not fish. They are cephalopods. So that's kind of the answer to that question right there. So that's why they're called cuttlefish. Now, as far as other questions go, the person who asked that, by the way, was Maddie 14.33. So thank you for that question. The next thing is going to be Cayenne Anthony 03, I hope I said that right, said anything involving their intelligence. So one thing that I was going to talk about was the cuttlefish that passed a cognitive test. So several years ago, there was an article that released On sciencealert.com, it says a cephalopod has passed a cognitive test designed for human children. So cuttlefish have been put to a new version of the marshmallow test, and the results demonstrated that there's a lot more going on in their brains than we previously thought about. So the marshmallow test is basically a child is placed in a room with a marshmallow. If they're basically told if they cannot eat the marshmallow for 15 minutes, they'll get a second marshmallow, and then they'll be allowed to eat both marshmallows. So basically teaching that child to delay gratification rather than just eat the marshmallow immediately. So cuttlefish were able to pass a version of this. They basically tried to get a cuttlefish to refrain from eating some crab meat, and then once they have learned that something will be available like shrimp, which they deem more tasty to them, they will actually go for that. They'll actually wait and have the shrimp instead, even though they could eat the crab right away. So they actually designed another test for about 6 common cuttlefish, and the cuttlefish were placed in this tank that has 2 enclosed chambers with these doors so they could see inside. In those chambers were some snacks, basically raw king prawn in one, and then a much more enticing live grass shrimp in the other one, according to the article here. And basically the doors had these symbols that the cuttlefish had been trained in order to recognize. When the circle, if there was a circle, it means that the door would open for them right away. A triangle meant that the door would open after a time interval between 10 and 130 seconds. A square, only used in the control, mean that the door stayed closed indefinitely. In the test, the prawn, or the less tasty option, was placed behind the open door, while the live shrimp was only accessible after that delayed door. If the cuttlefish went for the prawn, the shrimp was immediately removed. In the control group, the shrimp remained inaccessible behind that square door that wouldn't open. The test found that actually all of the cuttlefish in the test condition decided to wait for the live shrimp, but they didn't bother to do that in the control group because they couldn't access it. So pretty interesting. That's something cool about their intelligence right there, that they're able to do that. So thank you for that question right there. Next question, can you keep cuttlefish as pets? So DLSVVVV, bunch of V's, asks, can you keep cuttlefish as pets? Now I did a little bit of diving into that. You can keep them as pets. It's very hard, and I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you don't know a whole lot about keeping fish already. Even though cuttlefish aren't fish, if you don't know anything about keeping a fish tank, I would probably forget trying to keep cuttlefish as pets. Now, unless you like work in an aquarium or you're highly advanced in terms of your knowledge with aquariums, I would not try to keep a cuttlefish as a pet, especially not several. If you were going to keep them, you would need to do some extensive research. They have extremely short lifespans, and they usually have specific requirements like a large tank. They usually need live prey and very specific water quality requirements. So you can keep them, but it's very hard. Now, would it be cool to have one? Absolutely. I do agree. I think it'd be a really cool pet to have, but once again, similar to octopus, if I had a pet octopus, I would probably get way too attached to it. Even if I was advanced at keeping cephalopods, I would probably feel a little bad about it. So, especially since their short lifespans would definitely be something I would have in mind the whole time. So, pretty interesting right there. Now, somebody else asks, Just Augustine asks, not really a question, but what's an interesting fact about cuttlefish? Well, the flamboyant cuttlefish actually walks on the seafloor. They have very small cuttlebones, which, if you remember from the beginning, that's the structure that allows them to manage their buoyancy in the water column. So they have a very, very small cuttlebone, and because of that, they can't really regulate their buoyancy as well. So they actually walk on the seafloor. They have these 2 little extended areas of the mantle that they kind of use to walk around, along with 2 arms that they walk on. It looks like they're walking on 4 limbs on the seafloor. They're some of my favorite cuttlefish out there. Very small species, but There we go. Now, how did cuttlefish get its name? IL00KD something and C nothing. I don't really know how to say that name exactly, but they asked how did the cuttlefish get its name. Once again, they're essentially called pillowy fish. If you are interested, just scroll back a little bit to where I answered that question already. So there we have it. What eats cuttlefish? Black Mansif asks, what eats them? So sharks, moray eels, large fish, maybe some crustaceans like large crabs eat the smaller ones, but generally speaking, they're not a apex predator. They're kind of in the middle. They eat crustaceans and fish and other things like small worms, but they also do get eaten by lots of other animals. And also marine mammals like dolphins and seals will also go after cuttlefish as well. Now, Starry Night Sky asks, what's the impact on their ecosystem and why or how do they communicate? Well, basically, because they're predators, they help to control populations of smaller crustaceans and fish. Basically, they fit into the food chain and the food web by controlling those smaller animals like smaller fish and crustaceans, but they're also a type of prey themselves, so they help feed larger marine animals like the sharks and dolphins, big fish, seals, you name it. They're kind of in the middle of the food chain, not super high up, not super low down either, and it all depends on the species as well. Larger species are probably not going to get preyed upon as much, but the smaller species can fall prey to things a lot more easily, and that's just how that's how the animal kingdom works. Now, if they are present, it means that it's usually a healthy marine habitat. If the cuttlefish are thriving, it usually means that there's a balance in the predator and prey relationships in those areas. So thank you for that question, Starry Night Sky. Now, Evan Bish 7 says, how does their camo work? I think they camouflage, right? Yes, they do indeed camouflage. So they have those chromatophores, those pigment cells. They also have these reflective cells called iridophores and leucophores in their skin that allow them to rapidly change their color and texture as well. They use that with their very sophisticated nervous system that allows them to match backgrounds or create those moving patterns like I mentioned before. What's interesting too about cuttlefish and chromatophores in general, if you want to know how they work, chromatophores, imagine a balloon. Imagine you have this bright red balloon. It's very, very dark, deep red while it's not blown up. Once you blow it up, it turns to a kind of like lighter red color, much different color than when it's not blown up. That's kind of how chromatophores work. While they're expanded, they're lighter. While they're retracted, they are darker in coloration. Kind of a similar way that those chromatophores work. Now, Sierra 1330 says, why do they stand on their little arms if they can be neutrally buoyant? Now, the majority of those that do that is going to be the flamboyant cuttlefish or other species that might have those smaller cuttlebones that aren't able to do that. So even though they can regulate buoyancy thanks to their gas-filled cuttlebone, sometimes they can rest themselves on the seafloor to kind of just stay steady. Sometimes they want to scan the environment or just simply rest and conserve some energy. It's also similar to how some fish with swim bladders will use their fins to kind of rest or hover near the bottom. Some fish even rest on the seafloor. So it's kind of similar to that regard. Now, Sierra 1330 also asks, why do they have shorter arms than their cousins? So their arms can kind of appear like they're shorter or stouter than those of squids. It's kind of just a result of their different body plan and the way that they fit into the food chain. Morphological differences help them hunt closer to the seafloor and utilize camouflage. They're much more well adapted to benthic environments than squid are. They're not necessarily benthic animals, but they're much more adapted to being closer to the seafloor, whereas squid are usually up in the water column a little more. They're more out in the open, kind of in the center of the water column, hunting small fish that way, typically. So that's a good, very, very good question, though. Sakura Serena asks, how long do they live? Well, I kind of already answered that, but basically most species live about 1 to 2 years. Some of the larger ones, like the giant Australian cuttlefish, can live slightly longer, but generally they have relatively short lifespans. And obviously lifespan can be influenced by a variety of things: diet, their environment, and the species. So for example, I'll do a quick Google search: lifespan, longest cuttlefish, longest lifespan. So that's basically going to be the giant cuttlefish. They can live about 2 years. And even then, that's not that long in general. The maximum lifespan, 1 to 2 years. That's about as long as they're going to live, unfortunately. So they live fast, die young. Cephalopods have very fast growth rates as well. That's why they're able to live pretty quickly and just grow exponentially within those first couple of months of being introduced into the world. So there you have it. Now, Muso3 asks, how many species are there and where are they mostly found? Well, there is around 120, a little over 120 different species of them, and they're usually found in the Indo-Pacific region. They're also found in the North Sea. They're found along coastal regions. They can be found in shallow coastal waters near coral reefs or seagrass beds, but they can also be found deeper in the ocean as well, as deep as 2,000 feet, depending on the species of cuttlefish that you're talking about. They're very, very common in the Eastern Atlantic, Mediterranean. So they are in the Atlantic Ocean. They're just in Europe. They're not in the Americas. So if you live in North or South America, unfortunately, we live where they're not found. They're also not found in the polar regions. So there you have that as well. So very good question, though. Thank you for the question. Cueva Seg 0302 asks, can cuttlefish go to libraries? They can't go to libraries, but if they did, I'm sure they'd probably just try to camouflage themselves. And they'd probably honestly find a book and read it somewhere and then camouflage so nobody would bother them. I feel like that's something I would do if I was a cuttlefish. So the real question would be, what do you think a cuttlefish would be reading? What kind of book? Would it be reading a nonfiction book? Would it be reading fantasy, science fiction? What kind of book do you think they're reading? That's the real question. Are cuttlefish evolved squid? That is what C. Synthonian asked. Are they evolved squid? In short, no. They do share a common cephalopod ancestor, but they did branch into separate evolutionary paths. When we're talking about cephalopods, there's a couple of different paths that they could have went down. So, there's squids, octopus, there's cuttlefish, nautilus, and then there's the anomaly, the vampire squid, which I will probably make a video about in the future, a YouTube video talking more in depth about the vampire squid. So each of these groups, though, they kind of adapted differently. Cuttlebones and cuttlefish, the pin shell and squids, and then octopus just being as intelligent as they are. So what color? So D4 or Day Gecko, I'm going to say it that way. I imagine that's how you say the username. Day Gecko asks, what color blood do they have? Well, they have this bluish greenish colored blood thanks to that copper molecule called hemocyanin that gives them that bluish greenish blood. So that is the answer to that question. But you also asked, how do they see what they're blending into? Well, that's a very, very good question. Their eyes are very, very highly developed, and they can actually detect some contrast and polarization of light, but not color in the way that we see color. They also use this visual input to adjust different camouflage patterns pretty much instantaneously. Some of the fastest reaction rates in the animal kingdom. So pretty interesting to think about right there. Now, Silver Moth 23 asks, what do they eat? Well, they mainly eat small crustaceans like shrimps and crabs. They'll also eat fish and sometimes other mollusks like snails or clams, things like that. Usually, if you're looking for a cephalopod in an area, at least when it comes to octopus, when I'm looking for an octopus in the wild, this probably applies to cuttlefish as well. If you're looking for one, if you see a bunch of shells like crab shells or exoskeletons from shrimp around an area, you're probably near some place where a cephalopod, maybe a cuttlefish or an octopus is around. So, Jacob Nowak 06 asked, if not friend, why friend-shaped? Well, I mean, that's a good question. That's funny. They seem very friendly to me. Obviously, I know we talked earlier about that one cuttlefish attack that happened on a lady. Gladly, she's okay. That was decades ago, but still very fascinating. But I would say that they're friendly, depending on them. Now, the question is, would we be able to befriend a cuttlefish? Who knows? So there we go. And then also, Peyton LeBron asks, and we'll end on this question. This is the last question we're gonna do because I think this is the last question we got. There was like a little over 20 questions. Peyton LeBron asks, average cuttlefish butt size. So interesting. Cuttlefish, they don't really have a butt like we do. So typically when they're talking about like a cuttlefish's posterior, they're talking about the mantle, which is the main body. Mantle lengths are basically the length of that main body cavity. So if you're wondering what the mantle is, it's kind of that football-shaped part of the cuttlefish. And the cuttlebone is going to be on the dorsal side of the animal. So if you're wondering where the cuttlebone is, it's on the dorsal side of the animal. It's kind of this oval-shaped thing as well, if you've ever found one. If you've ever found a cuttlebone and you're watching this on YouTube, comment down below and say that you found one. That's interesting, and where you found it, because that's pretty interesting to think about. So there we have it. Now that was most of the questions you guys had sent in. Once again, thank you so much to everyone that sent in those questions. Before every podcast I do, I'm gonna ask people to send in questions to answer at the end. So I'm gonna do that. If you've enjoyed this podcast, feel free to share this with your friends if they like marine biology, if you want to teach them about marine biology, or if you just want to send this podcast to whoever you want to send it to, feel free to send it to anybody. I'm going to have this on Spotify, on YouTube. I'm going to try to put it on Apple Podcasts as well to make it accessible on multiple accounts. So that's where we're going right there. But like real quick, let's do a real quick recap of cuttlefish. They're cephalopods that have these remarkable camouflage abilities, 3 hearts, blue-green blood, and they have a cuttlebone that helps with their buoyancy. They're found in tropical to temperate waters, but they're absent from the Americas as well as the polar regions. Their intelligence is on par with some of the more famous cephalopods like octopus. They have problem-solving skills and complex mating strategies. The giant cuttlefish in Australia has spawning aggregations that are numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They can involve clever tactics like cross-dressing to get those mating opportunities. Flamboyant cuttlefish can actually walk on their arms because of their smaller cuttlefish. It's a pretty interesting quirk that sets them apart from other cuttlefish. So once again, a big thank you to everyone who sent in questions. It was a blast reading through all of them and picking out some of the best ones to share on the show. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe to me if you're watching this on YouTube. Subscribe. If you're on Spotify, feel free to follow the podcast. Subscribe to the All Things Marine Life podcast. If you're following me on YouTube, or if you've just discovered me, subscribe to my YouTube channel, All Things Marine Life. I post longer form videos as well as shorter form videos about different marine animals. And I'd like to eventually cover all things marine life. That is the goal with the channel. Feel free to reach out to me with more questions, comment any questions or topic suggestions down below. Comment what animal you'd like to see featured in a future episode, what group or animal you'd like to be focused on next. So who knows what we'll explore next, but thank you all again for tuning in to the All Things Marine Life podcast. Stay curious about the blue planet that we live on. I'm your host, Caleb, coming from Florida, signing off. Stay curious about all things marine life. Thank you all and have an amazing rest of your day.